I'm delighted to see all of you on this post-election day. Still digesting all the exit polls and trying to figure out who voted for what and why. It was a long evening, but very interesting one. But today we're going to turn to the subject of fashion, which is something we are always interested in, and we just had a temporary interruption for the election, but now we're back to what we know is really important. The work of today's speaker could fill a museum of women's history in itself. Although Kathy Peiss's research has taken book form, more than a half a dozen of them and counting, not to mention all her articles, many of her subjects are visible, tactile material, the stuff of which museum exhibits are made. Her first book, Cheap Amusements, Working Women and Leisure in Turn-of-the-Century New York, published in 1986, examined the attitudes and experiences of young female workers in the garment industry. And Kathy did this by looking at what they did to entertain themselves, where they went to dance halls, amusement parks, saloons, Nickelodeons, places they could afford on their meager wages, and places where they met young men from similar backgrounds and negotiated ways to find love and friendship while still preserving their reputations and marital prospects. Cheap Amusements not only brought a fresh and original perspective to labor and working class history by looking at women. Women were often not considered to be workers, but Kathy pointed out that they were. But also by looking at how they spent their leisure time, that they weren't always working, but they had leisure time, and that was very important to them. And the book also brought to life the vibrant popular culture of New York City at one of the happier moments in that metropole's tragicomic history. I can see the exhibit at the National Museum of Women's History now. All those hard-working but fun-loving women garment workers decked out in their finest shirt waists and outsized hats, enjoying the thrills of the rides and the excitement of the crowds at Coney Island. From Ferris wheels and silent pictures, Professor Peiss turned to face powder and mascara in her next book, Hope in a Jar, The Making of America's Beauty Culture, published in 1998. This ingenious study brought together an understanding of the construction of standards of beauty, long a mainstay of feminist research, with the history of American business, showing how cosmetics became a multi-billion-dollar industry over the course of the 20th century. Also important in this book was the emphasis on race. Kathy showed how the beauty business provided opportunities for enterprising African American as well as white entrepreneurs, people like Madam C.J. Walker, Helena Rubinstein, and Elizabeth Arden. Again, the exhibit potential for this kind of history is endless. The ads for all sorts of products with their extravagant claims, hope in a jar. Indeed, the department store, hope in a jar, the department store cosmetic counters where women could enjoy a makeover, and of course the rows and rows of glamorous jars and tubes in which those miracle substances were packaged. In her most recent book, Zoot Suit, The Enigmatic Career of an Extreme Style, published in 2011, Professor Peiss turned to yet another important aspect of popular culture, namely fashion. And this time she focused on men instead of women. The Zoot Suit, for those who may not know what this refers to, is a kind of drape shape, a kind of loosely structured style of suit, with a very exaggerated look, adopted largely by minority men, African Americans and Mexican Americans, during World War II. It was designed and produced by custom tailors, creative tailors within minority communities. And the Zoot Suit was clearly intended to protest against racial discrimination by rebelling against white middle-class fashion conventions. It achieved its goal most notably during the Zoot Suit riot that occurred in Los Angeles in 1943. Again, I can see great exhibit potential here, visual evidence of the history of gender in America, not inaugural ball gowns or high fashion, but the outrageous garb of ordinary people seeking to express themselves through their clothing. As should by now be apparent, a theme runs through Kathy Peiss's work, the relationship between popular culture and gender relations, as well as race, ethnicity, and class. In other words, while taking on what might seem to be light subjects, dance halls, face powder, ghetto fashions, Professor Peiss is actually able to tease out deeper meanings that penetrate to the very heart of American history in all of its social, economic, and political complexity. I have no doubt that she enjoys her research. I remember feeling envious of her in graduate school. We both earned our PhDs at Brown in the 1980s in American civilization. Kathy got to go to the Billy Rose Theater Collection at the New York Public Library and look at ads for Coney Island and popular sheet music while I was slogging through journals of social work history for my own dissertation. But Kathy's research was always very entertaining, very rich, very amusing, but she has also shown through her varied studies the importance of taking popular culture very seriously. And U.S. women's history, among several fields, is the better for it. Currently, the Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Professor of American History at the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Peiss has been deservedly recognized for her pioneering work with numerous fellowships and awards, most recently the 2012 Melia Davenport Publication Award of the Costume Society of America for the book Zoot Suit. Her current research continues to delve into the field of fashion, but this time she returns to her focus on women. We are very fortunate to be able to hear about this new work today in her lecture, Woman Made Women, American Designers, Taste, and Mid-Century Culture. Please welcome Kathy Peiss. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I forgot to.
Please welcome.
I'm sorry. I meant to introduce Joan Wages of the National Women's History Museum before I introduced Kathy.
It's really quite all right.
This is Joan Wages, a fashion icon in her own right.
That was great. Well, so many of you have been here so often that you know that this is not normally the way it goes. But as many of you know, we've been reaching out across the country to create councils. And last week, our Los Angeles Regional Council did an event where several of us went out. It was just such great fun. But I can't tell you how many of the women, we had about 250 men and women attending this event. It was held at Creative Artist Agency, which is the agency that represents many of the major celebrities in Los Angeles. It was, we had a number of celebrities attending, and the number of women who came up to me afterwards and said, it never dawned on me that we didn't have a women's history museum. So it's the word that we want to spread across the country. And that evening, we publicly launched our public service announcement called Don't Tell Me I Can't. It features young girls who are actors who are dressed up as women from history. So the one who's Amelia Earhart, don't tell me I can't fly, my name's Amelia Earhart. And there is a wonderful one that says, don't tell me I can't be a businesswoman, my name is Estee Lauder. That would be relevant here. So the event was great fun. And then this coming Wednesday evening, we're doing our annual gala here in Washington, which will happen to be at the amphitheater downstairs. And it's, we call it the Diapason Honors. It's named after Christine Diapason, who is the first woman in Western history, in Western civilization to write about women's history in 1405. So we want to honor her, and we say, you know, here we are 600 years later, and we still don't have a women's history museum. We have not fulfilled her goal, and consequently haven't fulfilled our own goals. So we're working hard to identify a permanent home that will be on or next to the National Mall. So this next Wednesday evening, if you have any interest in attending, we do have even a few discounted tickets, and you can go to our website, nwhm.org, and purchase a ticket, or Sydney Winston in the back holding up her hand would be happy to get an invitation to you as well. So thank you very much for attending, and we're sure it's going to be a wonderful lecture. We can't wait. We always love something about fashion. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm going to go sit over there so I can see the slides. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Joan, and thank you, Sonia, for the introduction and for inviting me here to talk about this subject of American designers and the mid-century culture. I'm especially grateful that you came on the day after the election. My students, I taught a 10 o'clock lecture class this morning, and my students were, they often look a little tired at 10 o'clock in the morning, but even more so today. They were really suffering, so thank you for being here and being alert. So a Museum of American Women's History must address many different topics, among them the profound impact of women on politics, on social movements, and the economy. Today I want to make the case for the importance of considering women's cultural impact, not only their roles as consumers, as homemakers, as audiences, although those are very significant, but as producers of designs and goods that shaped women's everyday lives. And as Sonia said, this has been something of a life mission as a historian, and it still compels me. Many scholars are writing a new history of women that highlights their activities as trailblazing advertising professionals, business pioneers, retail specialists, and magazine editors, people who essentially are creators of a new idiom for modern womanhood. The impact of their activities was not a simple one. Discriminated against in the workplace, they achieved individual success against the odds. Some actively supported women's political advancement and equality, and others simply modernized and thus reinforced the dominant gender ideologies of their day. We still have much to learn about these women through the 20th century in order to assess their legacy. So my talk today focuses on a loose grouping of women designers, entrepreneurs, retailers, and tastemakers who began to reimagine everyday life in 20th century America. Among them were Lord & Taylor executive Dorothy Shaver, fashion designers Elizabeth Hawes and Claire Mcardle, and housewares pioneers Frida Diamond and Brownie Weiss. They were all quite different in their social background, experiences, and politics, yet interestingly, they shared a sensibility about their times. So they were distinctive women as individuals, as I hope to show, but I also want to suggest how much they were, like so many women from the 1930s to the 1950s, bound up in and engaging with the turbulence of their times, socially and politically, as well as aesthetically and culturally. Responding to the grip of the Great Depression and World War II, they envisioned new designs for living, as they termed it, driven less by the vagaries of fashion than by how ordinary people, especially women, actually lived. They were advocates of a self-consciously American, modern, lifestyle-based, seemingly classless taste. They sought to break down the distinctions between so-called class and mass markets, high-end and low-end. And they wanted to rethink the relationship between style and ordinary people. Well, just a little background on this, and then I'll dig into these individuals. Historians of design and domestic goods often contrast the ambitions of high modernists to the tastes of ordinary people in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Quote, ordinary people seem to prefer the decorative, the sentimental, and the massive, from rosebud china and early American furniture to huge chrome-plated refrigerators. However, the designers and tastemakers that I have looked at were less high modernists than what I'd call middling modernists. Their interest was less in imposing a standard of taste than in solving the problems of daily life as they perceived them. This phrase, designs for living, runs through their work as well as the magazines and manuals of this period. And these designs were made for a new social constituency, again, what I would term the mass middle class. This would become the lived experience of many people in the post-war period. But before that time, that experience was imagined by designers of goods and fashions, by manufacturers and tastemakers, as well as by Americans who were newly off the relief rolls, who were finding jobs in defense factories, fighting the war, and toiling in kitchens. It's important to observe that there were men who also played a very key role in these developments, such designers as Russell Wright and Charles Eames, working with Ray Eames, but also the predominantly male business owners who invested in this vision. But today, I'm here to emphasize the women in this enterprise who I would say, played an unusually important role in designing mid-century culture. So this lecture explores their work and perspectives as they created modern clothing and household goods, sought to redefine femininity, and advocated a classless taste for an emerging mass middle class. And as Elizabeth Hawes says, give us something original or give us death. So hopefully I'll give you something original. So I'm going to begin with one of the most intriguing of the women I've studied, indeed one of the most interesting individuals I've come across in American women's history, Elizabeth Hawes. An iconoclastic fashion writer, designer, journalist, editor, and labor organizer, she was one of the early people to be a multitasker, I would say. She gave talks on how to be 4 people at once. She's little known today, but in the 1930s and 40s, she was a household, her name was a household word. And although she found mixed success in the marketplace, she nevertheless had a profound influence on women's cultural history. So a little biographical information. Born into a wealthy Ridgewood, New Jersey family in 1903, Elizabeth Hawes graduated from Vassar, took courses at the Parsons School of Design, and then went to Paris in 1924, where she got a job as a copyist, and essentially that was a plagiarizer. She was there to plagiarize the Paris couture for New York manufacturers. As it went down the runway, she was quickly sketching, and those sketches would go back to New York to be manufactured cheaply. She also wrote on fashion for The New Yorker. Returning to the U.S. in 1928, she opened her own clothing firm, Hawes Incorporated, which produced expensive outfits for affluent women. By 1929, the onset of the Great Depression, women's clothes had begun to turn from the boyish flapper look towards a fuller, curvier silhouette. And Hawes' designs reflect that general shift, yet her philosophy of clothing was altogether different from the worlds of couture and ready-to-wear. She was a member of New York's avant-garde, called the Panther Woman of the Needle Trades by her photographer friend Ralph Steiner. Hawes mocked the pretensions of high fashion and brought a whimsical bohemian perspective to dressing. Picking up the catchphrases of the day, she named her designs The New Deal, Revolt of the Masses, Prosperity is Just Around the Corner, and Public Enemy #1. The clothes themselves celebrated simplicity of line and ease of motion. Deep pockets, ample armholes, natural shoulders. She designed for full-figured women so that stiff undergarments wouldn't be needed. She also loved pants for women. Although Hawes' and these are some samples, these are some sketches that she produced. The one with the tunic with the long with the pants is quite notable, from 1930. Swimwear and kind of very loose suit in a sort of Eileen Fisher style. And here are actual clothes that are now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They used to be in the Brooklyn Museum costume collection. Although Hawes' customs design was for the affluent, she looked for ways to translate good design for the pocketbook of working class women. She submitted a dress pattern in a contest held by the magazine Women's Home Companion in 1931, and she won. And unfortunately, I don't have an image of the dress. The magazine received 16,000 letters, with 6,000 wanting Hawes' designs. More significantly, she sought to make arrangements with ready-to-wear manufacturers and retailers to produce mid-priced apparel. And this is an advertisement of her collaboration with J.A. Livingston, who was a mid-priced manufacturer in sportswear manufacturer in New York. Each manufacturer, she believed, should have their own designer, and this would be a necessary step in attaining freedom from what she considered the domination of Paris designs. She was a political leftist and touted the Soviet Union's method of manufacturing attractive clothing for the masses. However, the challenges of achieving these goals proved too daunting. Manufacturers were resistant, and the economy of the 1930s simply did not favor a rethinking of mass and class goods. So, unable to pursue this vision of high-quality mass manufacture and restless for other challenges, she closed her firm in 1940. In many ways, Hawes's influence came as much from her outspoken writing and public presence as the clothes she designed. Her best-selling book in 1938 is called Fashion is Spinach. You're just going to have to ask me what that title means. It's really confusing. But Fashion is Spinach offered a full-throated critique of Paris couture. She attacked France's fashion dictators for their stranglehold on fashion. And of course, the word, to call them fashion dictators definitely had a resonance with the fact that Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, et cetera, were very much in the news by the late 1930s. She also attacked the New York garment industry for consigning working-class women to faddish, tasteless, and shoddy clothes. So she called for clothes that would break down the fashion class system. Again, inexpensive, high-quality clothes that met the needs of women across the socioeconomic spectrum and took their everyday lives into account. And this was an interesting combination, I think, of a kind of nationalism. Part 2 of this book, Fashion is Spinach, is called Buy American. But it also has a leftist and what at the time was called a popular front sensibility. Clothes, she said, were, quote, an expression of the social life of the time. And to insist, as she did, that all American women can have beautiful clothes would have required a revolution, not only in manufacturing, but also in the operations of class and status and the understandings of social worth. In 1940, Hawes became one of the founding writers of a newspaper called PM, which was a New York newspaper known for its progressive politics, a brilliant staff, visual originality, and a complete lack of advertising. It lasted only 8 years, so they just couldn't make it on that model. With her sister, Charlotte Adams, Hawes redefined the traditional women's page by creating the News for Living section, which, among other things, featured not only recipes for people at different income levels and household situations, but also investigative consumer reporting, for example, into rent price fixing. Hawes's fashion advice in PM was typically iconoclastic. She advised women to ignore the brassiere ads. She wondered if men might enjoy wearing skirts. She had a whole campaign denouncing hats. And she also was a huge advocate for women's trousers, which she saw as the war hastening that trend. And here, just to give you a couple of images, that's the Sears catalog on the left, working clothes for women in factories. And then the picture in the middle is a blow-up of a picture that was in PM magazine that says, this picture was taken last week on the outskirts, or should we say the outslacks, of Los Angeles. So being out in public wearing pants was still a rather noteworthy or interesting thing. Typically, she contrasted freedom-loving, slacks-wearing American women to German women under the Nazis' back-to-the-home movement. So News for Living promoted a self-consciously American taste, aesthetic principles based on informality, comfort, ease, and bodily freedom, available to all regardless of income or status. An aesthetic that underscored working people, cultural diversity, freedom, and democracy. As wartime came to the United States, Hawes's life took a sharp turn, wanting to support the war effort and also wanting to write a book about the new Rosie the Riveters. She got a job as a drill press operator in an airplane factory and wrote this book here, which is titled Why Women Cry, or Wenches with Wrenches. I thought I'd fumble that one. I worked on that. She then became a union organizer for the United Auto Workers, focusing on women's issues. After the war, seeking to escape the anti-communist fervor of the post-war period, she moved to St. Croix and then had a somewhat sad life towards the end. As this brief biography suggests, Hawes's life as a designer and promoter of a particular style and sensibility for American women was a complicated one. It was intertwined with the left politics of the Great Depression and the war and its confusing mix of views about women. On the one hand, Hawes accepted some of the gender stereotypes of her day, particularly normative and psychological views of heterosexuality and women's what she called principal preoccupation, men. Thus, she said in 1938, there's only one trick to designing clothes. Just do it so you see the woman, not the dress. When I dress a woman, I dress her for a man, because the woman would not know what she really wanted. It's interesting. At the same time, she dedicated herself to supporting young women and developing their design talents through dressmaker apprenticeships. Her books express tremendous advocacy of women, their freedom to live as they please, to work in male-dominated fields, and to have access to beautiful and affordable goods. So looking at the range of women designers, Hawes is on one end of the spectrum, highly articulate about the larger meaning of fashion and clothing, and placing that understanding within an explicit political perspective. Yet there were other women whose designs did much of the same work as Hawes, without necessarily the politics, in articulating a new vision of American women and culture. Hawes worked closely with another innovator, Dorothy Shaver, the premier women retailer from the late 1920s into the 1950s, and a little biographical information about her. She was born in, and I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Mena, Arkansas, into a professional class family in 1893. She was educated at the University of Arkansas and at the University of Chicago, and she found her first retailing opportunity when she designed and sold rag dolls with her sister, and she sold them under the label Little Shavers. Very good. You saw she has a future. Selling these dolls took her to Lord & Taylor, where she was hired in the early 1920s, and she climbed the ladder to higher positions of authority. She became a vice president of the company in 1931 and president of the company in 1945, and this is really a remarkable achievement for this era. She was best known for her promotion of what she called the American look, fashions and styles that, quote, reflect the life of our times, wearable clothes, especially sportswear. This was a campaign to promote American designers, again, in opposition to the authority of French fashion. And here's just a couple of examples of the collaboration between Hawes and Shaver. This is a window display in a Lord & Taylor, the main Lord & Taylor store in New York, where it says American designers on the bottom. And you can see those are all Hawes designs in the window. And this is an ad that, it's a Lord & Taylor ad that Elizabeth Hawes wrote. So it's Elizabeth Hawes writes her own ad for Lord & Taylor. So a very close collaboration. Beyond the promotion of the American fashion market and domestic production that Shaver wanted, there was something more, as she explained it in 1932, that was part of her motivation, and that was, quote, the undercurrent of national feeling that was beginning to make itself felt. Again, that sense of nationalism. With the Depression and the growing world crisis, a greater consciousness and anxiety about American identity was being articulated in everything from music to museums. Shaver's views on fashion flew in the face of the conventional wisdom of manufacturers and magazine editors. At one point, she debated Carmel Snow, who was the editor of Harper's Bazaar, who believed in French design genius and inspiration as the arbiter of elite American taste. According to a journalist who was present at the debate, Shaver replied to Snow's claims, "Fashion is no mystery. It serves the masses and the classes alike in interpreting our life and times." So from the 1930s into the 1950s, Shaver promoted American designers, including many women, at Lord & Taylor stores. She also established the American Design Awards in 1937 to help speed the economic recovery by, again to quote her, stimulating the creative urge in this country to do away with our infantile reliance on foreign design. Like Hawes, Shaver had interests beyond fashion per se, or more accurately, she connected style and clothing to larger intellectual and political interests. I think her politics were more conventional. I don't quite know. It's a little bit hard to tell. But she, being a business and civic leader, she certainly wasn't out there in the way that Hawes was. Yet she, too, like Hawes, saw clothing design on a much larger canvas. After business hours, one reporter observed, Shaver would rather talk of international politics than the new shoulder width. During and after the war, the American Design Awards that she had started began to be given less to designers of material things and more to designers of life. In 1946, the first year after the war ended, These awards went to Ruth Benedict, the famous anthropologist, Ernest Bowen, who was the director of the Cleveland Metropolitan Housing Authority, Leona Baumgarten, who was New York City's director of the Bureau of Child Hygiene, and to the New York State School of Industrial and Labor Relations. She stated, "Their materials are human beings, and their goal, harmonious human relations." And again, like Hawes, she continued to express after the war the idea that clothing was an expression of a whole way of life. But by the 1950s, in a Cold War context, it was expressing the difference between communist rule and democratic government. In addition to Hawes, the designer who exemplifies the ideal of American style, and oops, I forgot about this slide, so let me just quickly say, this is just a newspaper clipping about the American look. There are many of this sort that were promotional, clearly, but there was a concept behind it, the American look. And here we have the other designer that I want to talk about, fashion designer Claire Mcardle, who's probably familiar to many of you here. Again, a little biography. Born in 1905 in Frederick, Maryland. Her father was a banker and state senator. Her mother, a daughter of a Confederate officer from Mississippi. She spent 2 years at Hood College and then attended Parsons School of Design, beginning in 1926. Like Hawes, she started out as a copyist and adapter, translating Paris fashions for the U.S. market. This was clearly a career path. In 1931, she became the assistant, stealing fashion is the start of your career. In 1931, she became the assistant to the chief designer of Townley Frocks, which was a mid-market dress and sportswear manufacturer. Her boss accidentally died in a boating incident the next year, and when that happened, she stepped in and completed the fall line. In the 1930s, she was designing a system of interchangeable separates, using menswear fabrics and experimental fabrics, and like Hawes, waging war against shoulder pads. She, too, embraced sports clothing as the inspiration for all clothes. Her designs were very attentive to the body. This is to quote her, "I belong to a mass-production country where any of us, all of us, deserve the right to good fashion and where fashion must be available to all." Her monastic dress, which was introduced in fall of 19, and I don't have an image of it, sorry. I can just describe it. It was an unfitted, waistless shift, just straight down, kind of going out, that could be belted in a whole variety of ways. It was an instant success, won the dress award at the New York World's Fair that year. And here are some of her designs. These are also now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You have a really clear sense of their simplicity. She too liked trousers, dresses that were made for, quote, real women's bodies, and interesting use of fabrics and matching separates. She struggled to have her own name on the clothing, and this was something that was extremely important to her. The owners of Townley believed that they were taking a big risk in doing this, but eventually they agreed to a label on the clothes that said Claire Mcardle Clothes by Townley. So when you go on eBay looking for Claire Mcardle, look for that label. Her clothing designs were integral to Shaver's American Look campaigns, and after World War II, Townley became Lord & Taylor's biggest domestic account. So Mcardle accomplished, although she didn't own Townley, she accomplished much of what Hawes had sought, to combine mass production methods and well-designed clothing. So let's step back from these designers for just a second or two and ask who in the Great Depression could afford these clothes designed for ordinary women. And so just a little on the social history of this time and where clothing fits into it. Spending on clothing and household goods, as you could well imagine, declined during the Great Depression. Many women remade hand-me-downs, used secondhand clothing. They sewed clothes for their families, simple dresses for household work, good clothing for Sunday church or evening entertainment. All of that was commonplace. What seems to me the kind of crucial moment begins around 1938 and 39 as the international crisis in Europe and East Asia grew more and more threatening. through June of 1940, when the Germans invade France and occupy Paris, and of course, December 1941, when the United States enters the World War. At that time, in this kind of 1939 to 41 period, the economy begins to revive, and at the same time, there is a tremendously palpable sense of unease and the threat of war. And these two things fed the fortunes, the outlooks, and the dreams of what we might call a new social class or a reshaped social class of both men and women. And this is what I term a mass middle class in the post-war period. So market research, we have to turn to market researchers and advertisers to get a sense of who they are. As one ad agency stated, defense production and war mobilization had created a strange inverted prosperity, and advertisers termed these people the new rich. Working class people, their families, who had been unemployed, barely getting by in the Depression years, but who now were finding jobs and substantial income, producing the material of war. This is to quote a market research study. They still live on the wrong side of the tracks, but today the industrial war worker and his family are your biggest potential customers. Fashion industry consultant who went by one name, Toby or Tobey, and still exists as a company, advised dress manufacturers to pay attention to, quote, the new money customers, wives, daughters, and sweethearts of the war industry workers and feminine workers of the same industries themselves. They had money to spend for the first time in years, and some of them for the first time in their lives. Many manufacturers and fashion editors saw them as vulgar, ostentatious, uneducated, people with bad taste, which was expressed by their desire for splashy jewelry and furs. But others, like Elizabeth Hawes, had a different view. This is to quote her. I cannot see how anyone can have the effrontery to say that the mass of the people have bad taste. They have had a chance only for a few years to buy the nice, simple clothes that are currently considered good taste, and they are buying them as fast as they can afford them. And the most prescient of the manufacturers and advertisers believed that this group would have a long-lasting and profound impact after the war, which is in fact the case. I can give you just a little bit more information on this. So if you take like there was a study of families who had a pre-war income of under $1,000 a year. So that would be 1939, 1940. By 1943, over 95% of them were earning much more than that. The median income had gone up to nearly $2,500. 10% of them were making over $4,000 a year. Economically, they had moved up, but socially, they remained at the bottom. They did not move into better or more exclusive neighborhoods. They didn't do much to improve their houses. They were mainly concerned with getting out of debt, buying war bonds, having security after the Depression years. Once the U.S. entered the war, shortages and propaganda urging conservation also dampened the possibilities of rampant purchasing among them, even as the sudden infusion of income was, for many, a powerful spur to enjoy the moment. And again, to just give you a sense of what the world of consumers was then, because it is so different from our own world, one study found that urban housewives in 1940 bought on average 3 dresses a year, paying a total of $20. When you break down those figures, though, there's something kind of interesting that you can see. 29% of them bought none or 1 dress in that year, while nearly 1/4 bought 5 or more. So there was an important minority spending a good deal on ready-made clothing. A similar trend can be found with home sewing. Many women hardly sewing at home at all, but then there were some who were kind of super sewers. There's this one woman that I found who would make a dress for herself every month and then would sew house dresses and sports dresses as gifts. And basically using $1 worth of fabric would be enough for her to make a house dress or a street dress. In general, during the war years, women, quote, bought up in the purchases of clothing. They bought nicer clothing. And many cheaper items that had been made out of flimsy material and were poorly constructed left the market. A market survey in 41 suggested that women were most interested in fit, looks, and cost. Interestingly, about 20% reported they looked for the union label on their garments. Despite the differences in buying habits, the attitudes were fairly consistent. 2/3 of them wanted clothes that they could wear out all day, from the beginning of the day to, from lunch to theater. They embraced notions of simplification and comfort. They all were already, either through their direct experiences or by exposure to the trends that were promoted by people like Shaver, Hawes, and Mcardle, they were already patrons of the American look. And when they were interviewed about fashion influences, most of them dismissed Paris fashion dictates. More than half of them thought that the most stylish clothes came from New York. Of course, this survey was conducted during World War II, 3 years after the German occupation of Paris and the closure of Paris fashion houses, at least for the United States. That event was critical to women in design, retailing, the clothing industry, and women-oriented media. There was an organization called the Fashion Group made up of women. It had been meeting since 1930, and a number of quite distinguished women were the founding members. Shaver, certainly, but also Helena Rubinstein, Elizabeth Arden, even Eleanor Roosevelt, somewhat amazingly. And this group had long paid homage to the Paris fashion dictators. They had regular reports from magazine editors who would talk about the changing styles in each season. So they were in a state of shock when Paris fell, which did happen incredibly quickly. Margaret Peiss, an editor of Vogue, spoke for the group at its meeting not too long after that event in June 1940. And she said this: "In 6 weeks, we have seen the Europe that we knew changed. History written in tragedy, and with horror-stricken eyes, we have looked back upon the things we used to know. Our brains have reeled, our hearts have stood still, and there are not enough tears in the world to shed, and words fail us." The more hard-headed Dorothy Shaver observed that this was, quote, "an emergency, and at the same time, an opportunity." At first, the garment industry seemed lost and confused without French leadership. And as the United States entered the War Production Board devised regulations to conserve textiles and other materials used in clothing. So interestingly, the government, garment manufacturers, and union officials all together tried to avoid rationing and standardized garments, as had been the case in Great Britain with utility garments. But the government did, in a sense, become a fashion dictator regarding the silhouette and amount of materials that could be used in clothing. The American officials on this, essentially viewed fashion as a symbol of individuality and freedom. That was how they understood fashion. So they didn't want to confine the styles to singular styles, as was the case in Great Britain. The clothing limitation orders regulated everything from skirt lengths to pockets. It required a certain amount of simplicity and functionality. But the effect of these orders, interestingly, was to release designers' creativity and to have them really think again about a self-conscious American and modern style. Shaver described the wartime movement of American designers as, quote, "the epitome of everything American. It is young, it is feminine, it is without artifice, it is designed for the active, vigorous life lived by American women." And this style attracted many different women designers. Simplicity as an elegant style had long been a form of dressing for wealthier people. The notion of inconspicuous consumption, that you just need to be aware of the material and the sewing and all that. You don't have to be splashy. But this style became even more pronounced during the war years, especially popular among college students and working women, women in offices, in businesses. As one young woman explained to the fashion group, "How do we want to look? The main idea is never to look dressed up. That's why so many of us go without hats and without stockings. Simplification of everything is the motto." So this hatless thing, Hawes succeeded in her campaign. Claire Mcardle's designs during the war I think, exemplify this trend beautifully. She made low-cost dresses from denim, wool jersey, from cotton that was from government surplus weather balloons, and from linens used in butcher's aprons. And here are two examples. This is a denim, very simply designed dress, and the one on the right is a cotton calico. Both, you can see the simplicity of them. Urged by fashion designers to design a dress specifically for housewives and mothers, she came up with what she called the Popover Dress. And this is it. It had a, it came with the oven mitt, which I think is pretty, that was part of it, part of the design. But a very simple dress that you could just pull over your head. You know, it had a kind of self-belting wrap front, made in denim. It cost $6.98 in department stores. This was one of the most well-known and popular designs of the era. It's also the case that she didn't confine herself to the practical needs of women in the home. She designed one-piece jumpsuits, one-piece suits and jumpsuits. This is a famous photograph of Lauren Bacall. Yes, what to wear in a national emergency. You might want to take notes on this. This is Lauren Bacall supposedly listening to the war news in a famous photograph by Louise Dahl Wolfe for Harper's Bazaar. And then this sketch is probably my favorite of all that I have seen, which is, it's titled Surprise Alert. And it's what you will pull on when the air raid sirens go off and you need to run into the subway or into the New York Public Library, which is also a place for people to shelter. Unfortunately, I don't have an image of a particular tweed suit that she designed, but I'll just read you a little description of it. And Dahl Wolfe photographed it also for Harper's Bazaar. And it was photographed with a set of illustrations that included Billy the Kid, a photograph of, I'm sorry, not Billy the Kid, Buffalo Bill, a photograph of a 19th century American family, and also Flash Gordon. And the text reads, "A new aspect of fashion in the American grain. These clothes are related to the frugal modesty and dignity of the dresses worn by pioneer women, to the outlandish dash of our Wild West heroes, to the stitched and riveted sharpness of our American overalls, and to the almost abstract garb, the tunics, tights, and hoods of our great escape figures of the comics, Superman, Flash Gordon, the Phantom." And so you can see the imagination that is working here, both a nostalgia for an American frontier past and also the sense of what superheroes, including women, can do. This ad appeared in 1944. I should note that's the same year that the hit musical Oklahoma opened, as well as the Aaron Copland, Martha Graham collaboration Appalachian Spring. So this evocation of a pioneer past was extremely important in a society that was militarized and regimented during World War II. So these wartime styles, when the tastes of elite women designers and ordinary women began to have a bearing on each other, were not the only or even predominant styles available. Another response to government limitation orders was the closely fitted tailored suit with shoulder pads and tight short skirts, something along these lines. Again, the Sears catalog being a kind of good indicator of mid-level consumer goods. This style was extremely popular. It was a uniform for many women working in office, and it was considered a, quote, mannish suit. It was this suit, in fact, that Christian Dior reacted against after the war in his 1947 New Look, with its, quote, flower-like women in clothes with rounded shoulders, full feminine busts, and willowy waists above enormous spreading skirts. That style announced the return of the Paris fashion dictators and, in the symbolism of the clothes, the restoration of a traditional, although a sexualized, vision of womanhood. Now, the New Look was very controversial, subject of much commentary, but I would say it was probably not quite as innovative and singular as it has been made out. Mcardle and others in the U.S. anticipated the full skirts and narrow waists. You can see them in these kinds of styles, especially the sundress in the middle. So she anticipated this, but did so in the service of clothing for everyday tasks, everyday life. Even after the war, American designers continued to have a powerful impact on clothing, especially as an alternative to French design and in popularizing sportswear as everyday wear. And again, this sounds like a theme that comes out again and again, but it's just worth saying. Mcardle herself talks about the inspiration of American women in her design. And what she said was, and this was after the war, "For me, it is American, what looks and feels like America. It's freedom, it's democracy, it's casualness, it's good health. Clothes can say all that." But this message, by the time she was delivering it, had by then begun to feel like a truism. The rich context of the original assertion, that context of the Great Depression and early war, had dissolved away. So in the last part of this talk, I want to turn briefly to another form of material culture in which women played important roles in fostering a mid-century American style for the emergent mass middle class, and that's going to be housewares. Maybe even more than clothing, homes and home furnishings were the goods that were most deeply desired by the wartime new rich, and manufacturers and designers recognized their potential to transform the post-war world. During this time period, many prominent museums, Museum of Modern Art, Metropolitan Museum, Chicago Art Institute, mounted exhibits on designs for living, from residential architecture and interiors to furniture and kitchenware. And the debates over what was the appropriate form of modern living were quite vigorous. How to make the modern home warmer, more human, how to reconcile a decent living and working condition with a feeling of urbanity. Furniture makers argued over a style of sort of styles that reference the past, the Regency style, for example, as something that was unsuitable, superficial for the modern world. And what they wanted to do was to create furnishings that, quote, aroused mass America to the fundamental emotion of having its home, too, look the part and play the part that they should in the American scheme of living and in national morale. Imagining the dream house became a national pastime during World War II, and right after the war. There was a carpet company, for example, that ran a post-war contest about what does your dream house look like, and hundreds of people sent in, thousands of people sent in letters. American Home Magazine offered a dream house portfolio, which you can move all the little, furniture and walls and all this to help plan your post-war homes. This was before computers could do this for you. Concerns about the taste of the new middle class could be heard in much of this writing, and books like How Good Is Your Taste appeared after the war to provide guidance. So here, too, women's experiences of the Depression and the wartime home front were fundamental to their ambition and work in the housewares industry, and to the vision of American style that was informal and modern, in which mass manufacturing and design that was sensitive to the ways people lived could be combined. So I'm going to give you briefly two examples. One is Frida Diamond, an industrial designer of home furnishings and glassware, and the other is Brownie Weiss, a promoter of ingenious kitchen containers. So here's, somebody knows who that is. So here's Frida Diamond, a little bio. She was born in 1905 in New York, raised by her widowed mother, a theatrical costume designer. She graduated from Cooper Union's Women's Art School, taught design there, and then found work in a high-end furniture company. She spent some years designing for the wealthy, but she said finally she tired of being a court designer. And she said, I decided I wanted to do something real. And she found a job in an ordinary department store that attracted a working and middle-class clientele. As in fashion, there was a divide between the exclusive decorators and what was referred to frequently as Grand Rapids furnishings, because they were made in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and sometimes also called borax furnishings, and for the life of me, I do not know why. But if you ever see a reference to borax furniture, you know it's really cheap and shoddy and sort of overstuffed. Diamond was a pioneer in creating a notion of home fashion, of coordinating sets or ensembles of furnishings, and that's what she did for Stern's department store. After working for others in the late 1930s, she went into business for herself, and her biggest client was Libby Glass In 1942, she conducted a huge national market survey on consumers' taste and glassware, and then designed sets of decorated glassware for home entertaining. They were fun and informal, intended to be used for bridge parties and get-togethers. And those are actually those are not the decorated ones that are, of course, in the Museum of Modern Art. They wouldn't want the decoration on them, but that's the sort of shape of the tumblers that she created, and here she is surrounded by the many kinds of designs that she had made during her life. She pushed for the combination of mass market, high quality, and simplicity that the clothing designers had emphasized. She observed that design had to be developed, quote, the hard way, starting with what the woman likes and working backward to the designer who strives to please. That meant no magic push buttons, but equipment that has stood the test of madeless times, times without maids. Bigger bread boxes, workable salt cellars, handsome canisters, competent cookie tins, and jars for the kitchen. So she saw design as integral to mass manufacturing and worked closely with producers and retailers. Life magazine called her designer for everybody. But she remarked later in her life, it was an uphill battle all the way. The business was predominantly male at that time, though you'd expect it to be swarming with women. And finally, there was Brownie May Humphrey originally. I'll reveal it's the reveal, you know, like I'll do it before so you'll see who it is. Born in Atlanta in 1913 to a poor family in small town Georgia. Unlike the other women I discussed, I mean, she really did come from a very poor background. She had little education, again, unlike the other women. She attended a YWCA secretarial school. In 1936, she met Robert Weiss, who became her husband. She met him at the Texas Centennial Celebration. And apparently, the two of them were inspired by an exhibit on Ford Motor Company and progress. And they moved to Detroit, having seen this exhibit, in the late 1930s, where he found work as a mechanic. Detroit had become a boomtown with defense mobilization, and millions of Southerners, both white and African American, were going there in search of work after the long years of the Depression. So Brownie at this time was a housewife, but she began to contribute letters to an advice column in the Detroit News called Experience. The column spoke to the heartsick and lonely, not in the voice of the expert, but rather as supportive members of a close community. Taking the pen name Hibiscus, she wrote long, inspirational letters about her experiences moving to and living in Detroit, laced with sentiments about religion, family, and well-being. In one, she wrote about moving into an empty house with her husband and seeing a vision of home. And you will indulge this rather long quotation. I pushed open the swinging door between the kitchen and the dinette and saw it suddenly, not bare as other eyes would have seen it, but furnished and alive, with candles glowing over flowers on the table, with a coffee service and a great wooden bowl of salad on the buffet. I saw friends' faces there. I heard laughter and toasts. And then she goes into the kitchen. That, I thought, would look like an ordinary kitchen sink to anyone else, but to me, it's a magic carpet. I shall stand before it. Oh, the utter joy of being able to stand before it and wash my own dishes. You can't know how good it feels. It will be a privilege to polish glass there in the pool of sunlight. Ah, that kitchen was a gay gypsy flirt who beckoned me with impulsive arms. Now, I could go on, but a little goes a long way. But what I want to note here is Weiss's journey, first in the imagination, then in reality, from the deprivations of the Depression to the possibilities of sociability, abundance, and beauty in the home. These words resonated profoundly with the Experience readers who thanked Hibiscus for inspiring them. Brownie Weiss's later life perhaps will come as no surprise. During the war, she divorced her husband, got rid of him, and worked as a secretary in an aviation firm. When the war ended, she found work in direct sales for Stanley Home Products, then moved to Florida in 1949, where she sold housewares first for a firm called Patio Parties, then as an employee of manufacturer Earl Tupper. By the end of the 1940s, she had originated and popularized the Tupperware Party, selling plastic containers along with domestic sociability and the power of women's everyday networks to the new mass middle class. So these 5 women, Hawes, Shaver, Mcardle, Diamond, and Wise, they all have very different stories. Affluent and poor backgrounds, rural, urban origins, college educated in the secretarial track, very differently engaged in politics and civic life. Yet each, in her way, found a route through the hardship and uncertainties of the Great Depression and the war years to observe and to respond creatively to the social changes surrounding them, especially as they shaped women's lives. In charting an American style and American look, they were innovative, entrepreneurial, and distinctive. This was not a collective movement. Indeed, it seems poised between the great mass movements of women in the early 20th century, political movements in the early 20th century, and the post-1960 period. Their solutions were close to the ground. They centered on everyday life, and they focused on the importance of the aesthetic in the human environment. Yet their sensibility and promotion of a particular American look, bound up with notions of America itself in a fraught period of our history, resonate long after these women left the stage. Exploring these cultural contributions, seems to me, is an important part of American women's history. Absolutely. Fire away. Yes.
Could you please state your name?
When you were showing pictures of the pantsuits, and I noticed the dates on 1941 and 1941, and I was thinking back to the suffragist pictures standing in front of the White House in 1920 before they got the vote, and you didn't see pants, and all of a sudden it evolved. Did it come with the flappers? Did it come with Mcardle? What?
Well, there's a little bit of a story here. I mean, there was an effort of feminists in the 19th century to adopt bifurcated clothing, and it was often called the bloomer costume, sometimes called Turkish pants. And generally, those women were, harassed and derided in public, although it did become an outfit worn by women in colleges as they began to do athletics. And so the entrance for trousers or split, I don't know what you call it, just pants. They're not quite pants, but split outfits, really is in the sportswear field. So you do see women by, even as early as the 1920s, although not that much, engaged in athletic activities in which they might be wearing trousers. But it's very controversial through the 1930s when Katharine Hepburn appears in motion pictures in these gorgeous pants. She just looks incredible, with her long legs, incredible in them. It's commented upon. And a woman wearing pants is making a statement through the 30s. And so it's really with the war that makes it possible for women to just go out from their homes out onto the streets to go shopping or whatever, wearing pants with the justification that, they wear these pants in their homes and they wear these pants in the workplace now because they're working in factories, they're working as welders, they're working in environments in which they really need those for safety reasons. And that opens the door towards women wearing pants in public. So it's really quite late. It is really the 1940s that popularized
There's
it.
a kind of confusion in my mind because my mom would tell me stories. She played basketball in high school in the 30s. Mm-hmm. And this was in rural Ohio, so she wore shorts. And she said their games were more, people came to see them more than they did the boys because
Right.
the old farmers wanted to see the women in legs.
Right. So if it's within the confines of an athletic activity, then it's okay. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting when girls or young women start wearing shorts or bloomer-like costumes when they play sports. Like Smith College really embraced basketball for young women. When they were only playing amongst themselves for the college, they would be able to wear those outfits. When they had a public audience and men were in the audience, so this would be in the 1890s, early 1900s, they had to put on a little overskirt over the split pants. So you can see how, you know, it carries a very charged meaning through these decades.
One last question on the picture with her in the middle of all of her furnishings. Was that the mass market, or was that picture of her whole career?
It was the mass market, and that went with a feature in Life magazine about her being a designer for everybody, that everybody could afford her designs. Yes?
My name is Newbold Richardson, and I'm actually a costume historian. And I was just going to tag on about the issue of the trousers. It's also a little bit of trickle down from the upper class for the trousers, because in the 1920s you start to see for loungewear, for cocktail party loungewear at home, you start to see wonderful silk sets that are worn. And you also get what you and I would call now palazzo pants, and that sort of larger look. But it doesn't really trickle down to everyday gals, as it were, as you said, until the 1940s.
Yeah, I mean, there's this, I think, a really interesting phenomenon of designers with elite tastes and with elite clientele who, through the 30s, 40s, meet up with the needs and become interested in the needs of working class women. And so their design sensibility and the needs of working women meet in this period.
Betsy Griffith, you were describing the standard set during the Second World War, the pockets, the length. Mm-hmm. Who was setting those standards?
It was the War Production Board, which oversaw all American which set standards on American production. What they were part of, they did many things. It was a gigantic bureaucracy, probably bigger than this building. But what they did, among many other things, was to determine how much of a variety of materials, raw materials, et cetera, would be needed to be supplied for the war effort. So in the case of clothing, it was very important. They were making, clothing manufacturers were converting their factories to making uniforms, for example. And so they calculated how much fabric needed to be conserved, and based on those calculations, then issued a set of requirements that you could not put cuffs, for example, on a jacket or on pants, if you were a man, on the width of men's trousers, on the width of women's dresses, and the length of women's dresses. So they are the people who are doing it, and it's run by the people who run it tend to be people from the industry who become what are known as, quote, $1-a-year men. They give their time for the war effort, but they're also kind of keeping an eye out on their interests, because there's a great deal of consciousness about the post-World War II market, and they don't want to do anything that's going to destroy that. And they talk about this very explicitly in their meetings. So they're trying to come up with guidelines in which there can be sufficient creativity and individuality for fashion, but still conserve the material they need.
Were there any women in that bureaucracy?
No, not men. I mean, I cannot think of a single one. They were generally men who ran companies, who were manufacturers, and retailers. Yeah.
Hi, Dave Rabinowitz. It seems to me that after the war, back into the 50s, fashion for women seemed to revert. I remember in the 60s, Laura Petrie was seriously criticized for wearing slacks in public. And I'm wondering specifically about pockets. Why are there no pockets? Did they appear during the war and disappear in the 50s reversion?
Pockets. That may be a level, that may be, as they say, that's so granular that I may not have gotten there yet. I'm not quite at that level of analysis, the pocket. Generally, pockets they tried to get rid of pockets during the war because it was seen as wasted fabric. Certainly on women's clothing, take the pockets out. So I can't give you an analysis of pockets, but I think your initial observation that there is a style that emerges in the post-World War II, 1950s period that seems very much about a kind of extreme construction of femininity is very much the case, and those fashions become popular. Again, Dior's influence is great, France's influence is great, and those styles do take hold. What I would say is that by the 50s, because of the greater affluence of that time, women are able to dress, you know, to have sort of follow different styles into their different activities of life. So we would see sportswear, which becomes a mainstay for women, still following many of the principles that people like Claire Mcardle set down, whereas, you know, evening wear or you know, dressing for a party, that did have that hyper feminine look to it in the 1950s.
Two comments and a question. Jen was talking about our event in LA, and it was interesting. Fashion played into one portion of the program because Sarah Lawrence, one of the celebrities, she recognized her from her TV appearances, who was the MC. She had this very unusual dress, shirtwaist dress. It was gorgeous, but it was not of our time, sort of, so to speak. And she spoke of it, and she said she wore it on purpose. That her grandmother had designed it and made it for her mother's wedding, to wear at her mother's wedding. And she said this was her history, because if the dress did not existed, she might not either, because it was for her mother's wedding. So I thought that was interesting. Second comment, borax. I remember growing up, you know, all the ads on
Yes.
Death Valley Days and all that.
Right, that's what I
20 mule
associate.
team. So I wondered why that would play into what she
I
said.
still
That's
do
very
not
bizarre.
know why it's called
Yeah,
borax. It's one of those words that just
And
is
bizarre.
mystified me.
And the question, has anybody looked at the things in design, whether it be fashion or design, as you rightly point out, it's more than just fashion, things that were designed by men that then women, when they got into positions, redesigned them, that made them more useful for the home?
That's a good question.
Now, I think in terms of the corporate world, when you have bathrooms designed by men versus bathrooms designed by women, it's a whole different thing. You can always tell when a bathroom is designed by a man. So I just wondered if anybody had looked at that.
That's a really good question, and I will look for it. I don't have an answer to that. Yeah, I mean, I think that I will pay attention to that in my research. There's some very interesting, I mean, the Charles and Ray Eames and their relationship to each other, I think that's a really interesting relationship, because I think she played a role in kind of softening and domesticating some of those styles to make them usable, functional, comfortable. But I think of somebody like Russell Wright, who is very much in the vein of Frida Diamond, without any particular influences. So I think, you know, I think that would be a great thing to look at, and I will keep that in mind. Thank you.
Jan Duplain, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. It's fascinating. Couple of things I wanted to ask you. You mentioned that Hawes, I think you said at one point, did not support having hats.
Yes.
And I was
she
interested.
designed them, though.
She designed them because in the Lord and Taylor, and you saw them, and beautiful, wonderful,
Designs lovely hats.
and they go with everything. So what was her
Where can we get one?
This is personal. This is personal. So my question is, what did she have against hats? No, I mean, what'd she say about?
Well, she clearly changed her mind. I mean, in the 20s and early 30s, she was designing lots of hats, and you see advertisements for her hats. They're inexpensive, and they're quite lovely. I think when she began writing for PM, and it was the war years, and I think there was this sense of getting rid of superfluities, you know, and so women should go hatless in the streets. There's also a trend with men and hats too, again because of the issue of conserving fabric and other kinds of, you know, even the stiffeners in hats would be materials that would be needed for the war effort. So I think it was largely a wartime perspective that she brought to it, and being Elizabeth Hawes, who's an incredibly self-dramatizing person, she turned it into a kind of position, you know, that you must go hatless. But I think it had a lot to do with the war years.
Did you did you say that in the end she had a very sort of sad ending?
Yes.
What was that?
Well, she lived in St. Croix for a while. She had trouble supporting herself. She made a couple of attempts to come back to the United States and develop a fashion, relationships with the clothing industry. And it was as though she had been kind of left behind. And also, there was so much fear around people who were on the left. By the 1950s, there was so much fear of people who had had her politics in the 30s and earlier. And I don't know if she was formally blacklisted, but people wanted a kind of hands-off relationship with her. She ultimately died of cirrhosis of the liver, so that gives you a sense of a real decline, both physically and probably psychologically as well.
Also, very quickly, what about shoes? Do you follow shoes? I don't have a thing about shoes at all. But I'm curious about the changes and well, I was thinking of seeing somebody the other day. I mean, these heels that have gone impossible. You have to be very thin and very balanced to do what we do today.
Yes. Well, this reminds me of when I was working on my book on the cosmetics industry, and people would ask me about nails, hair. I'd say, I don't do nails, I don't do hair. I haven't done shoes, so I do know a little bit about the style. There were the wedge styles that were really popular in the 40s. And I don't think stiletto heels were, but people did want their height, and women did want their height in the 40s. So you see that wedge style a lot. I don't know if Hawes herself designed shoes or how she coordinated her, when she had a show, how she thought about styling the models, and I don't even know to what extent that kind of styling went on in that time period the way it does today. So I don't have an answer to that question.
Hey, that's okay. Last thing, very quickly. How did you personally get involved in the fashion? Was it something as a young girl you were interested in?
You're
clothes?
wondering about like this? Well, you know what they say about professors, those who can't do teach. Well, how did I get into it? I do, as Sonia said in her wonderfully kind introduction, I do have these obsessions. And what started me on this actually was a concern about the way that class had often dropped out of discussions of women in the mid-20th century. It's a very, very powerful category earlier on, certainly in the 19th century, into the 20s and 30s. But it seemed to me that in talking about these aspects of social life, class had, the sort of assumption of classlessness or a lifestyle-based distinctions between people seemed to be the most powerful category. And so what started me was thinking about where that even came from. And these women, to my surprise, had a great deal to say about that. Just this notion of a particular kind of American woman who isn't legible. You can't read her social class on her body, in a sense, through her clothing or through her housewares. And so that's how I got interested in them. It was a sort of intellectual problem that, and then of course I do like the clothes. So, how could I not? So sitting in the Brooklyn Museum and going through all these sketches and thinking, oh, I want this. Can I get somebody to make this for me? It's just the material cultural aspect of this is just personally appealing to me.
I told you she had a good time with her research. The rest of us are slogging through, government records and all this kind of thing, and she's looking at fashion. I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to make one comment and ask a few questions. One is a friend of mine ended up living in a Frank Lloyd Wright house in Madison, I think, and she said this goes back to your question, the kitchen was so small and unworkable. Frank Lloyd Wright just didn't care at all about the kitchens. And then I think if you go into most Frank Lloyd Wright houses that are open, you can't even see the kitchen. It's sort of considered to be inconsequential, so they don't even put it on display. So that goes back to that. A few questions. First of all, please do tell us about fashion, why fashion is spinach. Second, I was wondering if Hawes, whose name I've come across, of course, in Union history, but I had no idea about this other background. Hers is fascinating. Was she, or any of them, were they influenced by the Bauhaus? I mean, it sounds like very Bauhausian kind of notions about sort of popularization. And then the last question is, you mentioned Flash Gordon. I forget who it was who was influenced by Flash Gordon. But
Mcardle.
yeah. Was Wonder Woman involved in this at all? And didn't she wear pants?
She wore very tight shorts and tights.
Tights, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think for Mcardle, Wonder Woman would have been the feminine model. I think actually Flash Gordon himself would have been more the model. So no, Wonder Woman doesn't show up in this. The Bauhaus. I have seen no direct evidence of that. I mean, the design principles, I'm sure, are in the air, you know, but whether that is a direct influence, I've seen absolutely no evidence at all. And the spinach, fashion is spinach, it comes from a cartoon that she reproduces in the book. I believe it's from the New Yorker. It's a mother standing at a dinner table, and her son is sitting there looking at a plate, and the boy says, I say it's spinach and I don't want any part of it, or something like that. So that's where the fashion is spinach comes from. So, as I told you, it made no sense whatsoever. Right.
The actual cartoon was, I say it's broccoli and the hell with it.
Okay. Thank you. And that was, you know, so I don't know why it became spinach, and, you know, instead of fashion is broccoli, but I guess spinach might have sounded better, but that's very much in key. She's very kind of avant-garde in her sensibilities, and that would have appealed to her.
When Mcardle died in 58, I had a popover dress. I remember having a popover dress.
Oh,
yeah,
Sonia.
Yeah, but it wasn't made out of denim. It was made out of a printed cotton. I loved it. It was great. But I was thinking that maybe my first child was born in 1964, and I was thinking that maybe I got it then. But maybe I was kind of...
That would have been late.
Yeah, it would have been late. I think
yes.
I was kind of pudgy earlier, and I think it was a great... It was a great, you know, it covered many flaws.
Well, they continue to be made into the 50s. They continue to be made and sold into the 50s.
I noticed in the sketches of both Mcardle and Hawes, the women that they drew their dresses on were tall and slim. And I'm wondering, did you look at this trend of what ideal clothes horses were supposed to look like?
Well, almost all the designs have that kind of elongated female style that I think was simply a convention of fashion sketching. What is interesting, and what I don't know, what I've never seen enough of, would be, you know, what her runway show, what a runway show would look like. But it is, if you actually look at the models of the clothing, you can see that they are designed for women who are not necessarily that, you know, like size 0 or size 2, that these are women with shapes, with curves, with busts, with rear ends.
The sketches are thinner.
But the sketches have, let me see if I can, and actually hers are a little bit more, I mean, they're not quite as thin. The Hawes look is a little bit more. So those are very, you know, the extreme, a very stylized female body. But then if you look at the outfit, you're seeing somebody who's, you know, more of a, you know, right. Right, or at least they took courses there. I didn't graduate, but yeah. So it's a convention that both of them learned there. Well, I think the idea is to highlight the clothing. You know, what you can see on these sketches of Hawes is that attached to them are swatches. Which is they're just extraordinary to see in reality. I mean, when you open the box and you see these, you know, the material itself.
It's still there. Wow.
Yes.
It feels like the dresses for larger women feels like that's coming at a much later time. Because I know even growing up, anyway, it seemed like, well, what you see in all of your different fashion magazines and stuff, it's always thin women, and that's why I think so many of us were pleased when they opened up. What is the fashion that does it for larger women? There's
Moo-moos?
No, it's a company.
Oh,
Lane
Le-
Bryant.
Leslie-
Lane
Bryant.
Bryant.
Lane Bryant,
But that
yeah.
seemed late when we finally were acknowledging that not all of us were going to have these.
But there was Charles Williams in the teams Charles Williams stores in the
Great.
That had
Ask a real costume historian.
Charles Williams stores that were were the larger ones.
all the department stores, not better department stores. All the department stores had the stout. Were considered stout.
And of course, they also had tailoring as a much more central part, that you could, you'd buy ready to wear, but you could also get your, in department stores at least, you could get tailoring done. So that also makes a huge difference on the way that clothes look.
Did any of these, the fashion designers, did they work with any of the pattern companies?
Yes, they did. Home sewing pattern
Yeah.
companies? Yes, absolutely. Mcardle did in the 50s. I didn't put any images up, but there are a number of Mcardle designs that you can find, and I can't remember which.
Buttrick or Bacall's or?
I can't remember
Simplicity?
which one it is. It wasn't Simplicity, but I'm just blanking on what it is. And I can't, I really can't remember, but email me, anyone who really wants to know, and I'll get that information to you, because I know where it is, I just am not remembering it. And Hawes didn't do patterns, except that she was involved in this contest, and then you'd get a pattern from the magazine if you
Yeah, you
wrote
used to be
it.
able to write into the newspapers and get
Right,
a
and they
pattern,
would send you patterns. So yes, they were trying to get their designs out to a broad home sewing group of women as well as those who would buy.
Did they have any connection with home ec at all?
Not that I am aware. I won't claim to have read everything,
Yeah.
every archive, but I have seen no connection to home economics.
Well, I think I think when the museum has its fashion, when the museum has its not fashion, its clothing division, all of this will be absolutely, essential to our thinking about it. It's just great. It's really wonderful. Thank you so much, Kathy.